going to get to Splatterhouse, but before that, I have to talk about Namco. You may have noticed that over the last 60 episodes, there have been a lot of Namco games. In fact, 1 in 4 of my past 60 episodes have been Namco games. Between February of 1989 and July of that year, Namco released 15 Famicom games. Before this, on average, they were releasing 10 Famicom games a year, and they were by far the most prolific Famicom publisher. 15 games in 6 months is just crazy. And you might have also noticed that the quality of Namco's releases has fallen off sharply. Dragon Buster 2 gave the appearance of being an unfinished prototype. Dragon Ninja lacked technical polish. Child's Quest and Devilman both looked and played like something from a third-tier Famicom publisher. And Mindseeker probably shouldn't have ever been released. So Namco's releasing more Famicom games than they ever had, and the quality has taken a nosedive. And the reason for this is the obvious one. Namco was shoving every Famicom project they had out the door. You see, the very first Namco Famicom game was released in September of 1984. And you might have noticed the very suspicious 4-year and 11-month gap between the first game and the end of this swarm. And the reason for that is Namco's Famicom license had a 5-year term. During those 5 years, Namco's relationship with Nintendo turned very sour. Most of it had to do with the terms for US licensing, where Nintendo required that they would be the only people allowed to manufacture cartridges for the NES. Namco refused to agree to that, and so they licensed their games to other publishers. And in particular, they licensed their games to Atari. Atari infamously stole the code to Nintendo's copy protection chip and used that to make their own NES carts without Nintendo's permission. And Namco was on board with all of this. Meanwhile, in Japan, Nintendo was applying the exact same restrictions that they used on the NES to Famicom publishers. Only the legacy publishers who signed up before mid-1985 were able to avoid this. But that didn't stop Nintendo from trying. And it's worth pointing out here that this wasn't for quality control, or so they could put out better products. It was solely so that Nintendo could bleed more money out of publishers. That's why when NEC came along with the PC Engine, Hudson and Namco jumped on it. Up to this point, Namco had published 8 PC Engine games, many of them sequels to hits that were on the Famicom, and in a few cases, they were the same game, only released on the PC Engine well before the Famicom version. So with just about the worst blood between Namco and Nintendo, Namco's license to publish Famicom games would be running out in August of 1989. And they chose not to renew it. I'm going to spoil the ending here. Namco does eventually wind up renewing that license, but they never support the Famicom as heavily as they did before. They published 19 Famicom games between December of 1989 and December of 1993, basically averaging less than half of their regular output, and of course, far less than what they had done in the first half of 1989. They really were rushing these out the door, though. What was supposed to be Famista 89 wound up being released as Famista 90, because they couldn't finish it in time and wanted to get one more Famista game out before the license expired. Now, it's not like Namco could just send everything over for manufacturing simultaneously. That's why things were spaced out to a rate of about 4 per month. And that finally brings me back to Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti, the last game in Namco's Blitz that squeezed in just under the wire. It even wound up being the first port of Splatterhouse, one of Namco's popular arcade games at that time, as the PC Engine port took about another year to be released. So is this another half-baked release that they shoved out the door at the last minute? Shockingly, no. This is one of the best games that Namco made for the Famicom. The story of the game has your girlfriend weeping over your grave before you rise from the dead. But then a monster also comes back from the grave and kidnaps her. So then it's time to do the obvious thing. This is an action game where you run around as this cute little guy chopping into monsters with your meat cleaver. The cleaver is pretty slow and has some pathetic range, so you really have to time your attacks carefully. That said, the range isn't as short as it might appear at first glance, and the hitbox goes a little bit above and below you, so it's actually fairly forgiving. There's still a rhythm to the combat, though, that you have to get used to. And because of that, missing one attack, or getting hit once, will set you up to take additional hits. You have a life bar, and it starts out pretty stubby, but it grows by 1 every time you kill enough enemies. It's basically leveling up, though the only thing that increases is your health bar. Collecting candy restores 1 hit point, and also counts as an experience point, while collecting a hamburger restores 4 health. There's one type of weapon pickup that you'll find on a few stages, a shotgun. You get 10 shells when you pick it up, and it'll destroy anything directly in front of you. It also sends you flying when you shoot it. There's 7 stages in Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti, and you only have 1 life. You can continue 4 times though, picking up at the exact scene with the exact health level that you had, and every major stage also has a password that you can use, though there it takes you back to the minimum health level that you could have when you reach that point. Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti has a lot of parodies in it. Like here, where this mini-boss fight starts out with Thriller. Or this woman who has aliens explode out of her. There's also this guy who gets into a telepod with a fly and becomes a boss. He actually comes back later with a lot of flies like him, because life, finds a way. These set pieces are some of the most interesting things in Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti, though a lot of the times they come down to just having to endure the battle for a while. There's a lot of these segments, and even as you're just running around and trying to hit flying enemies, there's always some kind of distinct twist on them. Like here where you're getting shoved down this tunnel by the wind, and you really need to just get up and chop that mouse in the face. There's also a secret ending that you get to by finding all of the hidden stages. Those levels take you away from the regular horror theme to a new location. This isn't an especially complicated game. It's basically a one-plane beat-em-up where you move to the right and chop people up. Occasionally you have to do some platforming or interact with a background object, but that's really all there is to Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti. But even though the gameplay is simple, the level design is a lot of fun. It's always throwing something new and crazy at you. And the 8-bit versions of these horror moments are pretty cool. My only major complaints are that too many of the bosses are endurance matches, and a couple of the stages are way too long. Beyond that though, this one's got a lot of charm, it plays pretty well, it's not just the Splatterhouse name that makes this one worthwhile. I don't think it's top tier, but it's still really good.